So this is our last chapter. Chapter 33 is on animal locomotion and does two different systems in the body. It does the skeletal system, which I'll do in the first video, and then the muscular system, which I'll put into the second video. There are two crash course videos for this and a few videos on the Moodle site that would just sort of augment your learning in this chapter 33. A lot of this information is stuff that you know because you're quite familiar with your skeletal system and your muscular system. Oftentimes we understand things about our bodies because of things going wrong, but it does lead to a better understanding of how our body works or should work. So the skeletal system is made up of bones, cartilage, and ligaments. Ligaments go bone to bone, where tendons go muscle to bone. So we will talk about tendons as we move on in this because obviously there is a connection between the skeletal system and the muscular system. But really when we're talking only about the skeletal system, then ligaments come into play. Your skeleton is divided into two separate, or not two separate, they're obviously joined, but two different sort of divisions, if you will. So the axial skeleton is kind of the center. So that would be your skull, your vertebrae, and your ribs. My awesome little skeleton that I'm drawing here. Your appendicular skeleton would be everything else. So that would be your shoulders and pelvis, and your limbs, your appendages for appendicular. And so that basically is a funky looking skeleton, but illustrates the two different sections, if you will, of your skeleton. There's a much nicer diagram on the next slide. So this is showing you in red would be your axial skeleton, head, vertebrae, and ribs. And then the appendicular is your shoulders, your limbs, and your pelvis. There's a little bit of a close-up here on your spine. Your spine has a number of vertebrae in it, and so all the names of your skeleton are on this slide. It can be used for reference. A lot of them that we know based on, again, maybe you broke your radius or your ulna. Maybe you understand you've dislocated a patella or had a femur fracture. Those kind of ideas are often, a lot of these words we've heard before. Oftentimes with the vertebrae, if you know someone who's had a spinal cord injury, sometimes they'll talk about the spinal cord injury based on like this. It was a C3 fracture or break, or a T6 or something. That tells you where in the spinal cord there was damage and basically, or what bone in the vertebrae were damaged. The functions of your skeleton and your skeletal system, a lot of these are sort of ones that are pretty obvious, and I think you could kind of brainstorm off the top. Your skeleton supports your body, it protects your body and allows your body to move. But on top of that, there are some other functions of your skeletal system. Your skeleton, your bones are where blood cells are made, and so bone marrow is key in that. Red bone marrow, we'll talk about how there's two different kinds of bone marrow, but red bone marrow is the major producer of red blood cells, so RBCs or erythrocytes were the fancy name of that. Another key job that you might not think of immediately with your skeleton as a function, it helps maintain homeostasis in a few different ways. So it's going to help maintain the balance of calcium and phosphate in your body, basically being a bit of a store for those or a source of them. And so basically your body can kind of suck up or release calcium and phosphate as needed to keep that in check in your body. The other thing that your bones can do is maintain the pH of your body. And so your bones are another mechanism in your body that release and absorb components to balance the pH. Your bones can actually release salts that are alkaline or basic. That's another word. Remember, alkaline means basic, and that will help regulate the pH of your body. The fourth one, sorry, here is detoxification. And so if you are exposed to heavy metals or usually environmental toxins is where that would come from, or other foreign elements, your body could easily be overwhelmed by those elements. But your skeletal system helps by absorbing those toxic things and then releasing them or metabolizing them at a rate that your body can handle. And so basically, your body can store heavy metals, maybe mercury or lead, in your body can store those in your bones and then release them so that they don't have a massive effect on your nervous system or other tissues. And then your body can basically excrete those really toxic things. It's a really cool, hopefully not common function of your skeleton. So we've got a diagram here, parts of a long bone, and there's a number of really cool bits of a long bone. So oftentimes we think of bones as being somewhat inert, but they are alive. We've talked about how there are uh, osteons or bone cells that are alive in a matrix, and that's why we talked about bones cells as being connective tissue, or bones being connective tissue. If we were to take a look at a long bone, and you have a number of different kinds of bones in your body, but we're just going to focus on a long bone. So this might be your humerus or your femur. There's a number of components that we could take a look at. And also, you have a fairly reasonable understanding of some long bones. If you've ever had chicken wings, um, uh, there's some components here that you might recognize. So off the top, we have the articular cartilage, and articular cartilage is at the end of long bones. And the key job for articular cartilage is to basically reduce friction or cushion your joints. And so oftentimes people have had damage to their cartilage, you have really painful joints. Cartilage damage in your knee might be something that's common in our group, and that's makes it all too painfully aware what the regular function of that articular cartilage is. Most bones have a central cavity or a medullary cavity, and so they're hollow in a sense. Now they're filled with something, which I'm going to come to next, but that central cavity is the next component of a long bone. In that central cavity is yellow bone marrow. Now, yellow bone marrow might be, well, actually, there's a puppy right behind me chewing on a bone right now, and he is after that yellow bone marrow. It's a fatty substance in the central cavity that basically can be a reserve of energy for you should you need it. There's a cool thing that has evolved in humans, and that children's yellow bone marrow can actually convert and carry out the functions of red bone marrow in times of environmental stress. So, this has been an evolutionary advantage. If your yellow bone marrow can act like red bone marrow, your yellow bone marrow can produce red blood cells like the red bone marrow does. And so that's a key advantage if a child can overcome that sort of deficiencies in their diet or something to keep healthy. The next thing on our diagram here would be the compact bone. Now the compact bone is harder than the spongy bone, and we'll come to the spongy bone next. And basically the compact bone is a layer outside of what we're going to talk about as your spongy bone. So the spongy bone we're coming up to is in here. This would be spongy bone, literally descriptive in its nature. The compact bone is dense. It really does make up about 3/4 of the weight of your body, and it's harder, and that's what we want our bones generally to be. In contrast to the compact bone would be the spongy bone. And so the spongy bone, the key thing about this is that it houses the red bone marrow, and the red bone marrow is what makes the blood cells. So it's at the ends of long bones and in the middle of some of the others. So the other bones maybe don't have this yellow bone marrow, they only have the red bone marrow. But the key job of that red bone marrow is to make blood cells. On from these different components of the bone would be the outer layer. So the outer layer of your bones is called the periosteum. And basically the periosteum helps lay down new bones and also allows for attachment from muscles to tendons. You remember I said ligaments go bone to bone, where tendons go muscle to bone. And so that periosteum is what allows tendons from your muscles to attach to your bones. There are also tiny holes in this. And so you can see right here, this is a tiny hole. You may have noticed that even in bones, there's holes or cavities through or channels through the bone for the blood vessels. And so your bones are living cells, and it's important that we have blood and nerves going into your bones. The last thing here would be the epiphyseal. It's a funny word to say, epiphyseal line or the epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal line and the epiphyseal plate and the yellow bone marrow are two things that are different when it comes to comparing children's bones to adults' bones. And so the epiphyseal plate is like the growth plate. You might have heard of that. The growth plate in a bone. And so what happens is that the heads of a long bone are actually growing away from each other because this epiphyseal plate is the location where new bone length is laid down. And so in adults, the epiphyseal plate, the growth plate, has solidified into just a shadow of what it used to be, which is called the epiphyseal line. And so that's what we're talking about with growth plates. Sometimes you might have heard of that if you've had a fracture and it damaged the growth plates. Doctors might be concerned about that because of the overall length of a long bone. If you damage that growth plate as a child, you might have one leg that ends up being longer than the others. So that kind of goes through all of these notes that are the different components of a long bone. There's a few other little things of note here in that the bone cells are alive. They're kept alive by blood vessels, which I talked about, those holes through the periosteum. Hormones are important for that process of bone remodeling. And then there's also nerve intervention. If you've ever broken a bone, it hurts. And that's your sign that there are nerves in there. So we talked about how there are bone cells. There's different kinds of bone cells. In the crash course, he goes in at length about these. We don't have a lot in our book, so I didn't put too much in the notes here. So osteoblasts and osteoclasts are the two different kind of in this bone remodeling that if you want to hear more about is in the crash course videos. The bone matrix, that's again, as we talked about these being connective tissue. So we've got the bone cells alive in a matrix, and it's flexible protein fibers and hard calcium salts. There's basically a third organic, so that means carbon containing, mainly collagen, and a 2/3 inorganic. So those are basically more calcium salts, so no carbon in an inorganic salt. And basically, we all know how strong bones are. It is amazing what a body can do and withstand. And so as a biological system, this is really something I think quite incredible, is the overall strength of your bones. It's similar to reinforced concrete. For a living thing that can fix itself and have that strength, I think it's pretty amazing. The next slide here basically summarizes the changes and how a child's bone would compare to an adult's bone. So there were those two key things that were different. When we talked about the bone marrow, in children's, their yellow bone marrow could convert to red bone marrow as a bit of a backup to the supply of red blood cells. And so, you know, if that was your reality, you'd have an advantage evolutionarily, right? In times of maybe famine or something like that. The other key way that children's bones are different to adults' bones is the epiphyseal plate in a kid is converted to an epiphyseal line in an adult. Remember, we're not growing anymore, so we don't have a growth plate. That's what those epiphyseal plates were growth plates. And so those have stopped, you've stopped growing the length of the bone and laying out down new bone at that growth plate. And there's just a shadow, which is called the epiphyseal line in an adult. Again, in class, we can talk about this, but I think if you have broken a bone, you have an intimate understanding of this. And so basically, healthy bones do resist stress and heal from injuries. Bone cells are always reshaping bones throughout the life, or bone modeling. And we've talked about maybe bone density as a thing in human health in other courses or in first aid or, you know, just in your life. So bone density. And so what we're talking about is a proper amount of bone remodeling going on, because as you stress bones, you actually encourage this bone remodeling and that building of stronger bones. And so that's where we talk about bone density is stimulated by weight-bearing exercises. And so this is especially important in women because your bone density can be linked to your hormones. And as you lose hormones through life, you also lose bone density, especially for women, but generally as well. So broken bones can miraculously be realigned and immobilized. Um, it's amazing what they can do. And again, we probably have some examples of folks in the group taking this course that, like I said, are intimately aware of these realities and probably have some horror stories for us. Oftentimes bones are stronger where they've healed and won't break again in that location, but might potentially break in another location. And so basically they can fix themselves, which is really, really amazing. When things go wrong, it happens. And so as I was talking about bone density and losing bone mass over your life, it can lead to a condition called osteoporosis. And osteoporosis is basically low bone mass and a structural deterioration of the bone tissue. You might suffer from frequent breaks, and this is quite common, unfortunately, in women. So it's important to build your bone density and have a healthy diet to maintain your bone health. Osteoporosis can come from an imbalance of bone maintenance. And so, you do have to use it or lose it, eat well. And then also there is a hormone dependency in this. And so it's important to maintain a healthy hormone level, especially in women. And unfortunately, you can't really control that as you age. So if you start in a better place, you're going to have healthier bones as you age. The last little bit on bones, and this is something that's quite obvious and you can experiment with this. So you have different kinds of joints that allow different kinds of movements. And I know you know this. So we have hip or ball and socket joints, which would be your hip or your shoulder, work in that way. You can have hinge joints, like a hinge of a door. And so you might want to think of your knee. Your textbook talks about your forearm for both the pivot joints and the hinge joints, which is a little bit confusing, I think, a little bit. And so, but it really is like the hinge of a door. It's a back and forth movement, like a linear movement. The twisting movement, which you don't really want much of in your knee, so that's why I said knee over here for the hinge joint, could be illustrated with the two bones in the forearm of your body. And so that twisting that your elbow and arm is able to do is an illustration of a pivot joint. And so those are the three different kinds of joints, again, classified based on the kinds of movements that they have. We'll carry on with the muscular system in the next video.